The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
So, good afternoon, colleagues, friends, and young talents, my students. And my name is Pei Dongsun, Distinguished Associate Professor of Arts and Science in China and Asian Pacific Studies, Associate Professor of History at Cornell. It's my great pleasure to host the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative, the CCCI lecture series for the autumn of 2022. The series is connected to two courses I taught this fall: Fashion and Politics in 20th Century China and Life and Death in China under Mao. This semester, we will have four distinguished speakers. Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom will deliver today's lecture. Jeff is there. Some of the questions that our guest speakers will investigate include: how do we define politics from the fashion dimension? What was the political-sized fashion? How did fashion reflect the power structures? How did fashion become a way of obedience and resistance? And from the perspective of fashion, how do we interpret the human condition in China under Mao's rules? That means from 1949 to 1976. We thank all our co-sponsors for helping to make this series possible. With their generous support, we are able to invite first scholars to our self-chosen remote Ithaca. Professor Wasserstrom from UC Irvine, Professor Antonia Fernanda, historian, University of Melbourne, Australia, Professor Deborah Davis, sociologist, Yale University, Professor Simona Seg-Renak, anthropologist, University of Bologna, Italy. Now it's my great honor and privilege to introduce today's speaker, Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. He is Chancellor's Professor of History at UC Irvine, while he also holds courtesy appointments in the law school and the literary journalism program. He has written, co-written, edited, or co-edited dozens books. The most recent of which are, as author, Vigil, Hong Kong on the Break, and as an editor, the Oxford History of Modern China. You don't have, huh?
I don't have that.
Okay. In addition to contributing to academic journals, he often writes for newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, magazines such as the Atlantic, and the literary reviews such as the Times Literary Supplement and the LA Review of Books. The title of this lecture is Clothing, Kinship, Slogans and Songs in Chinese Protest Movements of the Past and the Present. Okay, now please join me in welcoming Professor Jeff Wasserstrom. Jeff, the central stage is yours.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to meet at length with Song Pei-dong, a historian I've long admired. And it's great to be part of an interdisciplinary series that includes people that I read in other disciplines besides history. So I think that's great reflection. And this is my second time at Cornell, and I'm really very delighted to be here. And it makes sense to be part of an interdisciplinary series at Cornell because its strengths in China across disciplines and connection between people in different disciplines is one of its hallmarks. You'll see actually the title up there right now is not the title that the talk formally has, but I'll explain why I use that title there in a moment. The thing that I want to do to begin, which is something I've taken to doing when I start talks anywhere now, especially that are being recorded, because a lot of things get recorded and they float in the ether, people can be watching it online, they could be watching it anytime and any place. But I like people in a room to know that what they're hearing is something that's happening now and happening here. So whatever topic I'm presenting on, I try to connect it to something in the news and something about the place I am. And luckily, this was very easy to do because even though I was invited to give a talk on fashion, when I thought about what I knew about fashion and how I could bring fashion into a talk, I paired it with, I thought of it as clothing, kinship, slogans, and songs, and the symbolism of each of them in protest movements. During the last week, as I was watching the news, there was something that brought up songs and fashion, but songs I'll begin with, related to protest. In Hong Kong, where there has been a block on all public protest during basically since the middle of 2020, there were the first public actions that had a protest dimension during the last week in quite a while, last 2 weeks, triggered by, of all things, mourning for the late Queen Elizabeth II. And I'll bring mourning of various kinds into a section of the talk, in part because of it, because there often are times when mourning the death of somebody can be an occasion for protest. Sometimes it's the death of a protester, but sometimes it's the death of somebody who seems very far removed from protests. An official or somebody that the state feels that they have to allow people to mourn because it would be unseemly not to. And once people are on the streets mourning them, sometimes they slip in protests. And this happened in Hong Kong. When Queen Elizabeth died, people gathered outside of the British consulate, and they were there, and people initially said, why are people mourning Queen Elizabeth? Well, Hong Kong used to be a British colony. Maybe they're nostalgic for the time of colonialism. And some of them might have been. But some of them thought, hey, this is an opportunity to be out in public when we won't immediately be arrested for doing that. And while we're here, let's bring up the fact either that mourning, bringing up the Queen might be a way of kind of saying we don't like the new colonizers of our state. It's a way of sort of taking a dig at Beijing. And it's also an opportunity to be out here. And what they did, here's where music comes in, not clothing yet. They began some people chanted a slogan, Hong Kongers add oil, jiayo, go. Basically, it's go Hong Kong. Something that used to be said at sporting events and now is particularly associated with protests. And they began singing a band song, Glory to Hong Kong, that's become a kind of alternative anthem for pride in a place. But it's pride in the city, not pride in the nation, which is what Beijing would like people in Hong Kong only to be paying attention to. And there was an arrest of somebody for playing harmonica to this, was arrested on the charges of sedition for this. In an ironic move, not under the new national security law, but under the old sedition law that was originally put in place to prevent people from dishonoring the British royal family, but actually they were there to honor the British royal family, but were still charged with sedition. But so this is something that I wouldn't have been able to include in a talk given a week other than this one. So what does that have to do with where I'm giving the talk? There I had to come up with that. So this is also another thing about how anthems and songs become something involved with protest. Also from the last week was when the Chinese anthem was played at Hong Kong's first home match before crowds since 2019, some people booed the national anthem. And one of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is a law has been brought in saying that it's breaking the law if you don't show respect for the national anthem of the People's Republic of China. This was something that people objected to during the protests, and it was then brought in after the protests. So songs, in this case, booing a song and also playing a song, are part of protest actions in a place now. So that's the moment in time. As for being at Cornell, I will be bringing into this talk at different points work derived from 2 books by present, or in one case past, Cornell faculty. Mara Yue Du's State and Family in China will come in as one of the things with slogans and songs and protests that I'll bring up is the way in which familial imagery can be related. Kinship is one of the themes here. Kinship, as I understand it, is going to be, in this case, also a kind of fictive kinship, as it is in the book, both people's literal kin and the idea of rulers of a state being a kind of father or mother figure, and protests sometimes being because the father or mother figure are not behaving the way the father or mother is supposed to. And actually, that was another part of the Queen Elizabeth protests. Queen Elizabeth is known locally, affectionately by some people as Boss Lady, was known as Boss Lady. And the idea, if you mourn Queen Elizabeth, you're also saying the recent Boss Lady of Hong Kong, Carrie Lam, was not acting the way we think somebody who's a mother figure should act. So it was subtle in that way. Power and Movement is by emeritus faculty member here, Sidney Tarrow, who retired from the government department, and I'll be talking a lot about ideas of repertoires of contention, which was something that he and even more so a collaborator of his, Charles Tilley, are associated with. And so I'll be bringing in both of these books at one section of the talk. So that's the thing. This is a slide that I wouldn't necessarily be showing any place other than Cornell. Again, of the moment, I haven't really talked about clothes or fashion, but the other thing that's been in the news about protests this week has everything to do with clothes and fashion, which were protests in Iran that have erupted after the death in prison of a young woman who was fell afoul of the notorious quote-unquote morality police, and it had to do with the way in which she was wearing clothing and particularly a headscarf. And one of the ways that the protests are being expressed are via an art of apparel with burning of headscarves, among other things. There's also been talk, and I have to track this down, of a song there's definitely a song being sung in Iran. A recurring theme is the role of songs in protest. Bela Ciao, which I don't know much about because I don't follow Iranian history, but there's talk at least that perhaps in Iran people are going to be singing or have sung, it's not clear, the song Do You Hear the People Sing, which has become a globally circulating song of protest, which was very important in the Hong Kong protests. And one of the things I'm interested in about songs and repertoires of action in general is the way they can be taken up in different parts of the world and take on locally specific meanings. In the Hong Kong protests, they sang Do You Hear the People Sing quite a lot. Before Glory to Hong Kong was written during the movement, Do You Hear the People Sing was sometimes referred to as the main anthem, or one of the main anthems of the protests. But one thing that happens that is important to track and that I'll be talking about is how even when we think we see the same thing going on in different places, sometimes there are local meanings to it. In songs, when you translate it, you often change little things about the meaning. In Cantonese, when you sing Do You Hear the People Sing, as the poet Tammy Ho's writing about it alerted me to, it becomes something quite different. It becomes Have you spoken out yet? So instead of saying, why don't those in power listen to us, it became for a time during the movement in Cantonese, we're all out here demanding that they listen to us, won't you join us? So it's a protest song in many parts of the world, but the repertoire can move, but it can take on different meanings. It has definitely moved to the mainland from Hong Kong during the protests against the zero COVID policy. Do you hear Do You Hear the People Sing is one of the ways that people have been expressing protest in a setting where it's very hard to do so. Finally, right now and right here, I missed by just a few days a talk by Ming-Ching Ho, who's working very parallel to me, and we have overlapping interests. We've both written on Hong Kong. He was here a few days ago, and we were regretting that he was leaving before I was arriving, so he said he would bring my work into his talk, and maybe he did. I haven't seen it, but I thought I would bring his talk into my talk. And so since he was talking about a century of student movements, the making of Taiwan's democracy, I realized that I'm going to be talking about a century of mainland and Hong Kong student movements. So I changed the title of my talk from I mean, I didn't change it, but I used this as a starting slide, a century of student protests in Shanghai, Beijing, and Hong Kong. So just as a kind of background about the actual name of the talk, I'm going to talk about clothing, kinship, slogans, and songs, and just give you a little bit of an overview before I do some sort of deep dives into some specific things. I am interpreting clothing to mean anything one wears or even carries, from masks to umbrellas, which are important in the Hong Kong case, umbrellas particularly. And for kinship, as I mentioned, I'm going to include non-blood or marriage-related forms of fictive kinship. And so the themes I'm going to keep going back to is that all of these things show up in all sorts of movements. I realize going back over the decades that I've been working on student protests and going through the decades of student protests I've been working on, that in one way or another, they show up in different ways, these things, as symbolically significant things: clothing, kinship, slogans, and songs. There are connections between eras, between places, between types of movements, and between protests, and there are other realms of life that are all worth watching for. What I mean by that is that in each of these cases, clothing, kinship, slogans, and songs, there are ways in which we see things recurring in different periods of Chinese history, sometimes the same songs with new words put to them, sometimes a similar use of song. There are things that move from place to place. Chinese protesters borrow things from other places, or borrow songs, or borrow tactics, borrow clothing, and so forth. These things flow. And there are parallels or connections between types of movements, that the same slogan, the same clothing thing can be used actually, or the same tactic, the same thing, can be used, or song can be used for actually things with different political meanings. There's a way in which they can actually be done radically differently. Perhaps the same song can be sung for a different reason in different ways. The Internationale was sung when the Chinese Communist Party was rising to power as saying, we identify with the international communist movement. In 1989, the protesters at Tiananmen, speaking back to the Chinese Communist Party, or trying to change it, sang the Internationale, in part because it's harder for police to rough you up when you're singing a song that the government loves. So the same thing can move between eras and between types of action. So the same song can be sung in an official ceremony and in a protest ceremony. In Hong Kong in 2019, some people sang a church song, Hallelujah to my Lord, when they were protesting, because it was harder to break up a religious-themed protest than a religious-themed ritual than a protest, so they could continue protesting while sort of protecting themselves from a song from another realm of life. So all of these are worth watching for. Another theme, connections can mean borrowing directly from another form of life, or inverting and changing the meaning of. In other words, when you see a similar thing being done, it can be done by a different group to just borrow from another protest, or it can mean an inversion. In the case of turning something into a protest song that's an official song, could be an example of that. Now, as these things move between protests, between movements, and between parts of the world, there can be changes in meaning that are subtler than inversions. And I just gave you an example of that with Do You Hear the People Sing, becoming Have You Spoken Out Yet? So these will be things to just keep in mind and keep coming back to. So I'm going to do a few sections. This section is going to be about clothing. It's an unusual form of fashion, and I really hope that Pei Dong is all right with my very liberal interpretation of the term fashion. You'll be hearing from real specialists in fashion. That's not me, but I have thought a lot, as many of us have, about one item of apparel, a mask. And so I wrote a little piece called 4 Masks and a Funeral that I'm going to summarize the argument for quite quickly, and it'll introduce some various protests. The first time that I thought seriously about masks, it had nothing to do with COVID. It had to do with the fact that a protest had taken place in China on the mainland over pollution. Masks at that point, pre-COVID, were largely associated with, they could be associated with illness that you didn't want to spread, or they could be associated with protecting your lungs from horrific pollution levels. So some artists in Chengdu decided that to draw attention to this, they would decorate local statues with masks as a form of protest. That the pollution was so bad that even stone monkeys were not safe from this. And this initially became a very clever kind of thing. How can you, people were holding protests in person, and they were being arrested and hassled for creating trouble, but how can you really bother people with putting masks on statues? Another thing about protest tactics when they're creative and interesting is some of the most notable ones when they enter a repertoire of protest, they can spread. So this was being picked up by people in different places. So there's some 4 masks in a funeral. The second time I thought about masks seriously, again, it wasn't about COVID. This time it was about masks that were being used in Hong Kong during the protests of 2019, in large part to protect from tear gas and potentially to disguise identity. And the most moving form of a sort of visualization of this that I saw, these images are not as good to show, but it is quite an amazing thing. After Glory to Hong Kong was written, there was a video put up that went viral that showed a masked orchestra and choir singing the song Glory to Hong Kong with images of young people being tear gassed. And when the magazine American Scholar ran my little piece about this, this was the image they used. So the mask at that point was to protect from tear gas. The third time that I thought seriously about masks, again, did not have to do with COVID. Instead, it had to do with the fact that I was in Hong Kong and was told by a well-meaning journalist I had just met that if I was planning to go out onto the streets to watch a protest, this was in December of 2019, my last trip to Hong Kong, I better have a mask, purely because of potential tear gas. And so the first mask I ever bought and ever put on was this very pathetic one, which would have done nothing much for tear gas. She also told me to get a bottle of water because to wash your eyes out from tear gas. So that was the fourth time I thought about masks was then partly was to do with COVID. This was in the spring of 2020, right after Vigil, soon after Vigil had come out, and I was invited to write something for, or I asked to write something for the Age of Revolutions blog about comparative revolutions. It's a really, really wonderful online site. And I decided to write about several things that were, I thought, interesting about Hong Kong related to fiction and film. And the last thing I came up with was the way in which Hong Kong seemed to have entered a Kafkaesque stage of absurdity of the forms of repression there. And the reason why masks come into that was after young people were wearing masks to disguise their identity from the police and to sort of not show up on surveillance things, and wearing them also to protect from tear gas, the government put in a law banning you from wearing a mask in public. In the spring of 2020, as COVID spread, the government brought in a law making it illegal to go into public without wearing a mask, but refused to rescind the law making it a crime to wear a mask. And this seemed to me a level of absurdity that Kafka would have understood. Now, these pictures, most of the pictures are ones I've taken. These pictures are from 2014, when I was in Hong Kong during the Umbrella movement and Occupy movement. And in Mongkok, one of the three districts where there were occupations, there was a people's library that I found just fascinating. And there were people's libraries during Occupy Wall Street in the United States. Occupy being something that's part of a repertoire that spreads to different places but takes on local meanings. And I think, there was a local library, but the people's library setup actually took on different meanings even in different parts of Hong Kong. In the Central District, which was largely students and intellectuals, the library partly was there to serve people who were trying to keep up with their studies while they were in the Occupy. In Mongkok, I saw, which is more of a working class setting, I saw a people's library, and I said to the librarians, the young people who were sleeping on the ground helping people get books, I said, oh yeah, I saw a library like this in Central. And they said, no, it's nothing like the library in Central. Because there, it's largely for intellectuals trying to keep up with the books that are in their life. Here, we have a more reaching out to ordinary people thing. We're trying to get people to read and to try to reach out. And they had books of like how-to books and celebrity books and science fiction and fantasy. And they had a section on fantasy where what stood out as I looked at it is actually a collection of Kafka. So there was some. So I thought of Kafka at that point, and I thought there were Kafkaesque as well as Orwellian and Huxleyan parts and other dystopian things, but Kafka took on new meaning when there was this law both banning and not banning masks. So those are the four masks that I think reveal different things about the Hong Kong story, but then four masks and a funeral, and this will link up to the thing about mourning as well. The last time I thought about masks, the final way in which I thought about masks, was wondering about masks and funerals. One of the last evening that I spent in Hong Kong in December of 2019 was to attend a vigil-like event. I'd finished writing Vigil, but Vigil was named for the annual vigil held on June 4th to commemorate those who died during the June 4th massacre near Tiananmen Square in 1989. But in Hong Kong, they began to hold vigils for people who had died as suicides that were seen as political suicides, or in this case was somebody who fell to his death running from a tear-gassed parking garage. And these vigils were dicey at that point. I mean, they were obviously seen as protest events to keep things. There was a lot of repression. So one thing you did was wear masks to them. So I was wondering, what do you wear to a funeral? Well, in Hong Kong, one thing you wore was a mask. And this is somebody wearing the V for Vendetta anonymous mask, which was something that was globally circulating as a form of protest, yet taking on radically different meanings in different places. So another example of that. So I'll talk more about mourning and things like that. There have been one of the things since the national security law came into effect in 2011, which bans all kinds of protest activity, or makes all kinds of protest activities potentially punishable by up to life imprisonment, a very draconian thing. It's often mentioned that makes the June 4th vigil illegal and impossible to hold. But there have also been moves to crack down on any even kind of smaller type vigils for specifically local events where there was violence or death. Okay. I've mentioned a couple of these ideas, but three of the books that were crucial to shaping my approach to protest throughout my career were the idea of repertoires that comes from mobilization to revolution. This idea that basically people often do things they have done before. They follow scripts. Once it's easier to get a large group of people to know what to do if they've done something like it before. And so there's a way in which protest traditions are incredibly important, and they can also be very mobile, that the same kind of action that's used by one group can be used by a totally different group. And you see this, there are right-wing sit-ins as well as left-wing sit-ins. There are call and response slogans in our own country that can be that can have totally oppositional kind of things. Big marches. There can be marches where if you don't know the internal context, you wouldn't know if it's against the government or for the government, because sometimes there are similarly staged things, so you need to pay attention. There's a way in which people borrow. And repertoires, though it's not as much, it is partially a theme in there, but it's one that I've been very interested in. The repertoire often is an inversion of an official ceremony, and a funeral is a good example of that. State funerals, what protesters do is often, if there's a martyr for a movement, they put them up as deserving of the same kind of honor as an official would. And thinking of kinship, they'll often say if the death of a monarch is seen as treat it with the respect you would the death of a parent, in the protest rhetoric, the death of a martyr is treat them like the death of a brother or a sister. And so these are repertoires partly, and this is just the kind of simple way I do it, is people are kind of lazy. The easiest thing is to do something they already know how to do. And crowds are difficult to keep on the same page. The easiest way is if the script is some variation of something they've known before. And yet also people are very creative, and what they can do to tweak a repertoire can be very impressive and exciting. Again, thinking of an American case, call and response is one of the most important parts of at least the protest culture that I grew up in as a kid who went to anti-Vietnam War rallies. What do we want? Peace. When do we want it? Now. So call and response, one person, that's borrowed from church traditions, particularly black church traditions. It came into the civil rights movement, was borrowed by the anti-Vietnam War movement, was borrowed by the anti-apartheid movement later, can be borrowed by all kinds of things. So it's something that is both easy to replicate and there can be creativity. Clifford Geertz's The Interpretation of Cultures. There are many things interesting about this book. These are all books I read in graduate school and they shaped me ever since. But thick description is saying there can be things in, he uses the example of a wink. If somebody closes one eyelid and opens it, that can mean you're making fun of somebody. It can mean you're flirting with them. It can mean you've got something in your eye. And if you don't know the detail of the context of the setting, and you don't try to unpack it, you can get it wrong. And I think there are elements of this that there's a need for thick description in protests and symbolism, and I'll give you an example of that. And finally, Politics, Culture, and Class in the French Revolution by Lynn, who was the one person in this group I actually got to study with and who really shaped my thinking on this. She presents revolutions as in part, she draws on both of these other scholars, but she also draws on Emile Durkheim's idea of revolutions as partly a transfer of sacrality, of rituals that kind of create an alternative sense of what makes the world work and what is sacred. And again, that the martyr being honored the way that the official or the king was honored is a way of thinking of that kind of sacrality. Having a new, if family relations have a sacred thing, you're creating your own version of this. Creating an anthem, The Glory to Hong Kong, is a transfer of sacrality. The idea that what you think we should figure as sort of politically holy, we've got a different idea of it. And there's a connection between these because you need to have something, a form may have to resonate. In the French Revolution, they had these new values that they wanted to present as sacred, and they reached into the past for Greek and Roman statuary gods and imagery to represent something radically new. So that's another example of reworking things that come along. Okay. Borrowing, inversion, and symbolic competition are part of protests. And Lynn Hunt conveniently actually says something about fashion. So I can bring it in here as one of the things that first alerted to me. And here's a section, freedom of dress is not usually counted as one of the inalienable rights central to modern democratic politics, but she says that actually it's often that there'll be a different way of dressing will have something to do with political difference. In the French Revolution, one of the most famous terms for a group was sans-culotte, people who wore short pants. There was also wearing a revolutionary cockade. There was wearing a liberty cap. These kinds of things show up often in this. And so there's a way in which an interest in fashion should have been baked into my interest, and I do occasionally bring it up in the past. Here I'm going to use an example of fashion of a sort. So in the American counterculture movement protests in the 60s, of course, there was differences in hair length or difference in dress. These can be ways that people do this. There were ways to be a radical woman was to, in China and other places, you bobbed your hair, you cut your hair short. In American male protesters in the 60s, often they wear their hair long and wearing less formal clothing. But I'm going to use an example of T-shirts from China to explain this. So these are images from the Tiananmen protests of 1989. It's not usually thought of as a fashion event, but after thinking about Peidong's series, somebody really should do something on fashion and the Tiananmen protests. I think there are a lot of interesting things going on. There's turning clothing into slogan-bearing things. There's also the headband, the headscarf thing, the headband use, which I saw happen on the streets. I wasn't in China in 1989 for Tiananmen, but I feel like if I talk about it enough and write about it enough, people will think I was there. But I was there in 1986 in Shanghai when there were warm-up protests. And it was the first time that, I can't tell if it's the first time. It's devilishly hard with protests to figure out when something's first done. But one of the first times, at least, that headbands were worn with symbols on them in Chinese protests, I think was at that time. And I think one reason perhaps was because people saw this being done in Korean protests. Korean protests that were anti-American imperial, were anti a right-wing authoritarian regime that was being propped up by the United States. So the Chinese state played images of those protests on television because they thought of those as good protests, because they were against capitalism, so this was, I think, borrowed in part from that. We shall overcome, though, the slogan there is borrowed from an American protest song. So even there you see this kind of fact that the tactics, the symbols and things sometimes can flow quite promiscuously across borders. And I'll give an even better example of this. So this was from Tiananmen. 1989, they're crushed. Students are not allowed to protest after that. The idea is that from 1919 to 1989, there were these periodic protests in which student activists on campuses took the lead. To an extent, these were very common from 1919, the May 4th movement that was the most famous of these, till 1949. They helped bring the Communist Party to power. After that, the Communist Party wanted to celebrate those protests of the past, but tell students that now they should help build socialism and not be out on the streets protesting. But protesters sometimes kept that repertoire alive. The Cultural Revolution came in, which was a very different kind of protest movement, but kept some elements of the repertoire alive. In 86 and 89, there was a real revival of what I think of as the May 4th tradition. 1989, they're crushed. For the next 10 years, students basically are not allowed to protest. Until 1999, when NATO bombs blow up the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and students want to protest, because the May 4th tradition was about authoritarian misrule and against foreign imperialism. They said this is an action of foreign imperialism where 3 Chinese people died in the embassy in Belgrade. We want to protest to show that we're as patriotic as the May 4th students and others that we get celebrated in our textbooks. The government is in a pickle with this. They want there to be anger and they want there to be pressure on NATO to apologize for this action, but they're uncomfortable with students being on the streets because who knows what they'll say when they get there. But they try to leap ahead and guide this outburst of student activism. They structure, they help bus students to the American embassy to shout out, down with American imperialism and things like down with American-led NATO hegemonism, which really rolls off the tongue. But they had better slogans than that. But I happened to be there in China for a conference about the 80th anniversary of the May 4th movement. And yet here was this kind of revival, but with a strange inversion of that May 4th tradition. And the authorities were allowing it to take place. Though also they did things like try to keep workers from turning out to help the students because that was seen as something that could be too volatile. And there was a point when they told students to go back. This is enough. And the students basically agreed to wind it down. Clinton apologized. There were various things happened. And so it didn't blow up, but it looked like it might. But here's all I want to kind of say about it. One is just that this was a very different kind of movement than the Tiananmen movement. It was government partially supported or at least tolerated, but they were gathering together with colorful signs. There were some elements that carried over and kept it alive, but mostly I want to focus on this photograph I took that I was very proud of, but it was a little fuzzy because I was, I was kind of scared. Not too scared, but they were shouting down with American imperialism. There was somebody who shouted, Shani, and which is, I want to kill you. But he stayed on the other side of the street, so I really wasn't that scared. And I was with a group of other foreigners, and I really didn't think there was enough police there to keep the students from becoming too anyway. But I was a little nervous while I was taking the picture, so it's a little fuzzy. And I thought this picture was absolutely wonderful, and I brought it home and showed it to my students at Indiana, one of them who was really interested in pop culture and protest, and I said, this is great. This student had the perfect t-shirt to wear to an anti-American imperialism protest. Che Guevara t-shirt. Che Guevara is associated with Yankees Go Home, anti-American imperialism. That's a perfect, isn't this cool? I said, Professor, you don't get it. I said, what do you mean? That's Che Guevara, isn't it? He said, no, Professor, you don't get it. And actually, this is a blow up of a larger picture. This is the bigger picture, and it's fuzzy here. I apologize again for it. But what he said was, do you see who he's standing with? Also has a t-shirt. It's a bad picture, but can anybody recognize who's on that t-shirt? All right. This is also dating me age-wise. Well, it's dating my student age-wise, because in '99 I was old and he was young, and now I'm just really old and he's probably pretty old. It's Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of Nirvana, who had died young, a figure of rebelliousness, but hardly a figure of anti-American imperialism, and actually would be, and the other picture, the picture of Che, which you can see from the bottom part of it when you really blow it up, isn't just any old picture of Che. It's the picture of the cover of the American rock band Rage Against the Machine's cover. So what these two students wore to an anti-American rally were t-shirts of their favorite American bands. And this is the need for thick description. This will seem like, oh, I was wrong. Well, I was sort of wrong, but on the other hand, it's not a complete misreading, because both Rage Against the Machine and Kurt Cobain are associated with young rebelliousness. Not join the revolution necessarily, rebelliousness, but youth rebelliousness and kind of heroism. And anyway, so that's my story about thick description. I've got another little section here, Mourning Becomes Electric, that I'll race through, and then toward the end of this is just about using the idea of funerals and death and how songs and clothing come into them. So mourning death, this is just, in Power and Movement, it mentions that actually throughout the modern period, funerals in various times and places have become associated with moments for protest. This is from just the last week. The dissident and exile cartoonist Badi Tio put out something about the mourning of Queen Elizabeth being away for an opportunity to protest. And Sabina Knight, a very fine scholar of Chinese literature who's interested in these things, brought up the fact that this is also, tweeted on top of that tweet, this is also a particular continuation of a Chinese protest tradition of using the time of honoring somebody that the government allows to be mourned to bring up other issues. And she brought up the fact that in 1976, there were big protests when Zhou Enlai, who was associated with, I won't go into the whole details, but Zhou Enlai died. He was a major official in the Chinese political system, but he was associated with a group that was trying to rein back in some of the excesses of the late Cultural Revolution. So they had to allow him to be mourned because he was a sacred figure in the revolution. But people used the opportunity of mourning him to say, and let's hope China moves in this more kind of cosmopolitan direction. And it became the April 5th movement of 1976, giant protests at Tiananmen, that's sometimes called the first Tiananmen incident or first Tiananmen movement, and then it was crushed. But then also, she pointed out in 1989, the protests, the Tiananmen movement, began with mourning celebrations for a reform figure, Hu Yaobang, who had been demoted but not fully purged. So when he died as a minor official after he had been first in line to succeed Deng Xiaoping, the government had to allow him to be mourned. The students turned it into a protest tradition. They showed up because they were allowed to protest, to mourn, and then they said it's too bad that young people who shouldn't die, and older people just live on, clearly referring to Deng Xiaoping, who they were, and other party elders at that point. Great, I thought. Sabina's taking this back to 76. It is, but it actually goes back further with protest and mourning. And here's just an image of when, one thing was they didn't send the head of state to England, but some places sent head of state to England to mourn Queen Elizabeth. Instead, though, China was one of the places that only wanted somebody lower down in the hierarchy. In 1976, when Zhou Enlai died, Mao didn't show up at the funeral. They had Deng Xiaoping go instead, though Mao was represented by some calligraphy. When Deng Xiaoping died, I'm not going to get into kinship in the full way that I might have in another talk, but here's another example of it showing up. Deng Xiaoping referred to, for me, Zhou Enlai has always been my elder brother. So he was presenting him as a key figure in the hierarchy that way. This is a picture of the Hu Yaobang ceremony, the mourning. There was an official funeral inside, and then there became another funeral outside. And this is by the Monument to the Heroes of the People's Revolution, which was in a sense saying Hu Yaobang is kind of seen as having become a minor member of the revolutionary family, but we see him as a major and sacred one. And again, students weren't necessarily that wild about Hu Yaobang. Some of them liked him fine, but just as with mourning Queen Elizabeth, it was a way of taking a dig at the people who were more powerful there. But you don't have to go just back as far as 1976 to do it. There were also in the May 4th, 1919 and May 30th, 1925, really big mass movements. There were funerals as protest activities in China as well. This will just come in a minute, but I bring it in because of fashion. This is just a story about in 1986 when there were protests. The New York Times, one of the few places that really brought in the history, said that students in Shanghai have often been involved in protests. And in 1919, one thing they did was their ubiquitous broad-brimmed straw hats, they stopped wearing them and put on simple white cloth caps when it became clear that the straw hats were made in Japan and they were protesting Japan. There was a funeral in 1919 in which the wearing of the white caps was part of that as well. But in fact, you can go back further than 1919. I went back to 1919 mostly in my first book and dissertation. But if you have a good career, you train students who tell you about things that you missed during your own work and maybe go forward. And one of my first PhD students I worked with worked on the 1905 anti-American movement in China, in which there was a major event, was a funeral for a political suicide. And here's something that relates very much to Mara's book, even though I won't be talking about it as much as I might have. The editorial by a supporter, this was a boycott against the American Exclusion Act against that was particularly prejudiced against Chinese immigrants. An editorial in a Hong Kong-based newspaper commented, in the past, people have died for a dynasty or a family. There were private sacrifices to the imperial house or family, but Feng, this political suicide, was a common person who died for his country. He died for the public interest, and we should have these rituals to honor him as a true relative rather than that. And a popular song was written for it. A memorial service as a boycott vehicle. It was devised to generate min qi, people's spirit. Do not think it is weightless. Only then can success of the boycott be expected. And the analyst of this, Wang Xinqiang, the scholar, wrote when this was in Modern Asian Study, Feng was honored as, quote, the mother of min qi, of people's spirit. I got to look up that quote because I'm curious if it was mother rather than father. Gendered part of language is very interesting in all of these things as well. In my book, I did talk about a memorial service for one of the, between 1919 or 1925, were 2 times when protesters were killed by police. 1919, one who was beaten up and died later became a kind of saint of the May 4th movement. During the May 30th movement, there was a foreign-run police force were killed quite a few people in Shanghai. And there were memorial services, and the memorial services were like the memorial services for officials. They followed similar kinds of things. They both had large contingents of mourners. They both had music. School bands played and groups of students sang before and during one of these marches in Shanghai. Banners, in one case made of silk and peacock's feather, cloth in the other. This is again a way of adapting the protest repertoire. And marchers wore distinctive clothing. This is the only thing I said about fashion, really, in my first book. But various costumes were worn in the ceremony in 1917 for an official who died. And in 1919, this was about the funeral procession for the martyr who died in Beijing from being beat up by the police during May 4th. They wore special black armbands as a way of signifying their solidarity through clothing. And they wore the white hats that were part of that. So this was like moving from official ceremonies to protest ceremonies. But then when the Kuomintang, usually KMT, but I put GMT there, when they came to power as the first of these revolutionary groups to have power, they then put on marches, they put on funeral ceremonies and things that borrowed some of the same techniques that had been that they had become used to during protest events. Then they were in power, and there were student military bands that would play during parades. There would be military uniforms, and they would sing songs, but they were songs celebrating the status quo rather than calling for a change in the status quo. Anti-civil disturbance songs were some of the things they sang. And the nationalists, at that point then the Communist Party were the insurgent groups singing down with the authorities songs. The Nationalist Party were the in power, and they shifted from singing protest song to singing preserve the order song. In Hong Kong during the last couple of years, the Communist Party has been trying to introduce anti-protest songs into the repertoire of youth, trying to get youth in Hong Kong to sing not just the national anthem, but also songs about the value of stability. They're now doing exactly what the Kuomintang did at that earlier time, and like the Kuomintang who were challenged by the CCP, they're being challenged as well. Mourning ceremonies, the vigil, the last legal vigil was in June 4th of 2019 for the Tiananmen protesters, and there were candlelight. That was a photo I took. It was the first vigil of this kind I went to. There were also ways in which, again, this may be a good place to close and just take questions. A case of a continuation of a symbol, thick description. The Goddess of Democracy statue was one of the symbols of protest in 1989 in Tiananmen Square. It was knocked down in May of 1989, just before the massacre. It's never been able to be displayed on the Chinese mainland since. A replica, though, stood on the Chinese University of Hong Kong campus until about a year ago or so. And so this was something associated with death and mourning of 1989. It went along with the vigil as well as another statue did at Hong Kong University, a different one. But it was also changed by the clothing it was put on periodically. On Gay Pride days, it would be wrapped in rainbow clothing. In this case, I took in 2017, it had a skirt, she had a skirt, a black and white skirt, with the names of all of Hong Kong's political prisoners, people who had disappeared into prison, so not died, but disappeared, and so are honored somewhat in related to ways that people mourned. And it was written out on the strips, which changed this, which localized it, which brought it forward in time, and which also connected it to people who, in the language of the Chinese of the protest movement in Hong Kong, in Cantonese, were referred to by a term, and I don't speak Cantonese, so I won't say it, which means hands and feet. Hands and feet, which means siblings.
手足手肘
Xiaozhou. Great, thank you. And so it became key in the movement. And if I had the whole part on kinship here, I would talk about how you have different kinds of terminology, often terminology of siblinghood and of identification, but also an idea of saying that the authorities are not acting the way parents should, and your comrades are acting like siblings should. During the Hong Kong protests, when Carrie Lam said she was the mother of the people of Hong Kong, and like a mother, her own children get spoiled sometimes and she has to be tough with them, she had to be tough with the protesters. Then a whole group of of Hong Kong mothers sympathetic with the protests held a mother's march and saying that this is how a real mother behaves. We protect our children when the state tries to stop them and they're on the right. So you have competitions over, is somebody really living up to their role, and also an alternative kinship thing. And the idea of mourning going along with protest hasn't disappeared. This has also showed up on the mainland with the coronavirus protests early on, about particularly around the figure of a doctor who was an early whistleblower and then died of COVID. And the state had been criticizing him for for revealing things, but then tried in another form to co-opt him to then say they were treating him as a hero. But sometimes people were using the opportunity of mourning him when he died, or on the anniversary on Qingming, a day when you honor the dead in your family. Some of them then would honor him, which again was a kind of say he acted more like a proper father to the people than the people who are in power. So I will end that there and take any and all questions or comments. Thanks.
Okay, so let's, I gave a